Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're plunging right into the aftermath of World War II, the immediate effects, but also the long shadow it cast.
Exactly. It wasn't just an end, it was a radical beginning in many ways.
We've got quite a collection of sources here. Wikipedia details on various countries, the political shifts, some really interesting articles on air warfare.
And timelines, info on the Allies. It gives a pretty broad picture.
Our mission really is to connect those dots. Go beyond just the facts and treaties, look at the surprising changes, the power shifts.
And the seeds of future conflicts, which were definitely sown then.
Absolutely. We want this to be engaging for you, the learner, highlighting those aha moments, trying to build that clear picture of the world after 45 without getting bogged down in excessive detail.
Okay, let's get into it. Because the speed and scale of change right after the war, it's genuinely striking when you look closely.
It really is. Borders, economies, ideologies. Everything felt like it was in flux.
Totally reshaped. And our sources lay that out pretty clearly.
So let's start with the economic fallout. The situations were just wildly different depending on where you looked.
Oh, completely. Take the UK.
Right, a victor, but economically, the sources say, severe privation.
Yeah, they poured so much national wealth into the war. I mean, even before Lend-Lease kicked in properly. That figure, $437 million just on U.S. aircraft.
Staggering for the time. And over half the workforce in war production. What did that feel like beyond the numbers? The long-term impact?
Well, that hardship wasn't just abstract. It hit daily life hard. Rationing continued long after the war into the 50s.
Well,
Oh, yeah. It affected social programs, Britain's global standing, its ability to hold on to the empire. You could argue it set the stage for a kind of relative economic decline for decades, even while, interestingly, the Soviet Union saw a rapid production increase right after the war.
that really highlights the cost, even in victory. Now, flip that coin. The United States.
Ah, yes. The U.S. situation was dramatically different.
Untouched by the bombing, the devastation that hit Europe and Asia. Their industry wasn't just intact, it dominated. Roughly half the global output.
Incredible, isn't it? And their GDP just soared. That economic power gave them immense leverage.
What kind of leverage? What did it let them do?
Well, it powered things like the Marshall Plan, the European Recovery Program. It allowed them to project influence politically, culturally. They basically got to write a lot of the economic rules for the post-war world.
Setting the stage for superpower status.
Absolutely. That period was foundational.
Okay, Italy, another fascinating case. Rough start economically, then stability, even high growth in the 50s.
But also huge war reparations.
Yeah.
And they lost territory. Istria, Dalmatia.
Leading to that massive exodus, hundreds of thousands of ethnic Italians displaced.
Exactly. The Istrian Dalmatian exodus, it really underscores the human cost when borders get redrawn. These weren't just abstract lines.
Communities uprooted, lives changed forever.
Generations impacted.
And Japan.
Oh, wow.
Talk about a turnaround.
Right. Initially, the Allies planned this deindustrialization. Take them back to 1930s living standards, essentially.
But that didn't quite happen.
No, not fully. The U.S. occupation policy shifted, partly because the aid needed was just becoming too expensive. The Johnston Committee report in '48 flagged that.
And the Cold War creeping in.
That was a huge factor. The U.S. started seeing Japan less as a defeated enemy and more as a potential bulwark against communism in Asia.
So rebuild rather than punish.
Pretty much. Shift towards economic reconstruction. And look what happened by the 80s. Japan's a global economic giant.
It raises that question, doesn't it? How often do those immediate strategic needs, like containing the Soviets, change the whole approach?
A constant theme in international relations, you could say.
Germany, too. Similar initial decline under occupation.
But then West Germany hits this remarkable recovery, doubling pre-war production by the late 50s.
And France rebounded quickly, too, with the Monnet Plan, modernization, growth.
Yeah, the French managed their recovery quite effectively. So you see these really varied paths shaped by internal plans, external pressures, aid.
A complex mix. Okay, let's shift from the economy to the political and territorial side. The map itself changed,
Drastically in some places. We mentioned Italy losing its colonies, the border shifts.
but Korea, that division at the 38th parallel, a classic example of the war's end setting up the next conflict.
Textbook case. Japan surrenders, the Soviets occupy the north, the Americans the south. That initial trusteeship idea falls apart.
And you get two separate republics by 1948.
directly leading to the Korean War just a couple of years later. It became this immediate Cold War flashpoint.
Why Korea specifically? Why such a flashpoint?
It was where the two blocs directly bordered each other through their occupation zones, and they backed completely opposing systems. A unified independent Korea just wasn't feasible in that climate. It became a proxy battleground.
China, too. Incredibly complex. The Soviets gave up their base claims.
But the Civil War didn't really end cleanly. It sputtered on for decades, really. And the Taiwan issue.
Still with us today?
Absolutely. The sources note U.S. support for the KMT on Taiwan, and then the Korean War breaking out. That seemed to stop any PRC invasion plans at the time.
How big a factor was Korea in shaping the U.S. stance on Taiwan?
Hugely significant. It locked in U.S. support for the nationalists. Taiwan became seen as another front line against communist expansion in Asia.
Which led to decades of military and political backing.
Solidified that division.
And politically, globally, the big one, the United Nations.
Right. Born from the ashes of the war.
With the Security Council, the Big Five allied victors as permanent members. U.S., U.K., France, Soviet Union, Republic of China.
And crucially, veto power for those five.
Which tells you a lot about the intended power dynamic, doesn't it?
It reflects the reality of 1945. The UN needed the buy-in of the major powers to function, or at least to not be actively blocked by them. It was pragmatism alongside the ideal of collective security.
And interesting how those seats changed. PRC taking the China seat, Russia inheriting the Soviet one.
Reflecting the shifts in global politics over time.
Okay, so this leads us straight into the dawn of the Cold War. Europe, obviously, a central stage.
The main theater, initially. The U.S. wanted a strong, united Western Europe. Partly economic recovery, partly a counter to Soviet influence.
So the Marshall Plan wasn't just charity.
Oh, no. Strategic investment. And encouraging economic integration, like with the Ruhr Authority evolving towards the coal and steel community, the EU's ancestor.
And the sources mention covert U.S. support, too, for federalist movements.
Yes, the American Committee on United Europe.
Right.
Trying to nudge things towards a more unified Western bloc.
Then the military alliances solidify. Western European Union in 48, NATO in 49.
Direct responses to the perceived Soviet military threat. What specifically were they afraid of, beyond just Soviet divisions?
Well, it was political expansion, too, right? Fears of communist parties gaining power in vulnerable Western European countries.
Exactly. And the need for that U.S. security guarantee. It was about containing communism, rebuilding, and collective defense. West Germany joining NATO in 55 then triggers the Warsaw Pact on the other side.
The lines were drawn. And it wasn't just armies and treaties. Espionage, propaganda.
Big time. Radio Free Europe, CIA, KGB, Britain's Information Research Department. A whole infrastructure of covert influence and intelligence gathering sprang up.
And the sources mention something maybe less known, radicalization of extremist groups in Western Europe, both far left and far right.
Yeah, the intense ideological battleground of the Cold War created space for these groups. They sometimes found, tacit or even direct support from one side or the other in the bigger struggle.
Okay, now this next part is, well, it's pretty striking. The recruitment of former enemies. Scientists, spies.
Operation Paperclip is the famous one. Relaxing denazification to get German scientists, about 1,600 of them, to the U.S.
For their expertise in rocketry, aviation, framed even as intellectual reparations.
Well, the Soviets did something similar with Operation Osowieckim, deporting thousands of German specialists and their equipment eastward.
What was driving this? Just pure technological advantage?
Primarily, yes. The Cold War arms race, the space race, it was kicking off. Both sides saw this German expertise as absolutely vital. The urgency sort of overshadowed the past of the individuals involved.
But it wasn't just scientists. The CIA, other agencies, recruiting former Nazis as spies. At least 1,000, the sources suggest.
Yeah, and concealing those ties for decades in some cases. Again, the perceived threat from the Soviets often led to these very pragmatic, if ethically dubious decisions.
And the British recruiting in the Baltic states for operations inside the USSR.
Operation Jungle. Trying to infiltrate agents, but it was heavily compromised, partly by Kim Philby, the Soviet double agent inside British intelligence. It shows the intensity, the desperation almost, to gain any edge in that early Cold War shadow struggle. Morally murky, to say the least.
Definitely. Okay, let's shift gears to air warfare. Its legacy from the war was huge.
Massive transformation. The U.S. Army Air Forces basically became its own independent force.
And the doctrine shifted. Air supremacy became key. Before major ground offensives, MacArthur in the Pacific really pushed that.
Tactical air supremacy became central, and Field Manual 120 formalized air power as an equal partner to ground forces. What was the big idea there?
It meant air power wasn't just support anymore. It could achieve strategic goals on its own, or at least co-equally with the Army. A fundamental change in military thinking.
And the tech race during the war was incredible.
German Stukas early on, but then radar issues later. Their jets, the Me-262, came too late.
While the Allies developed effective defenses, think the Dowding system in the Battle of Britain, integrating radar and command.
And long-range escorts like the P-51 Mustang. That changed everything for the bomber crews.
Absolutely. Allowed daylight bombing raids deep into Germany. It was this constant innovation cycle. Radar helps defense, long-range fighters help offense.
Precision weapons started appearing too. German Fritz X, U.S. Azon bomb, early guided munitions.
The very beginnings of that technology.
Strategic bombing itself. Still debated, its effectiveness. British night area bombing. U.S. precision daylight bombing. Sort of.
Yeah, the results of morality are complex.
Yeah.
But then the U.S. tactics shifted dramatically against Japan.
Under General LeMay. Low-altitude night raids with incendiaries.
Removing defensive guns from B-29s to carry more bombs. The firebombing of Tokyo and other cities, utterly devastating.
What was the thinking behind that shift?
The goal was to destroy Japan's industrial capacity, much of which was dispersed in smaller workshops within cities, and to break civilian morale. Maximum destruction.
And then late in the war, the Japanese introduced kamikaze tactics.
Suicide attacks, starting late 44. They did inflict damage, especially at Okinawa.
Couldn't change the outcome.
No, showed the desperation, really. Depleted resources, resorting to the ultimate sacrifice. The U.S. countered with attacking airfields, more fighters, radar ships.
Which brings us, inevitably, to the atomic bombs, Hiroshima, Nagasaki.
The decision that ended the war, but ushered in the nuclear age.
Still fiercely debated, was it necessary to avoid an invasion? Potsdam Declaration ignored.
The immediate result was horrific destruction, loss of life on an unimaginable scale. Japan surrendered August 15th, VJ Day.
The long-term consequences, the nuclear arms race, the ethical questions, we live with those today.
Profoundly shaped the next half-century and beyond.
So let's wrap up by touching on some lingering issues, things not neatly resolved in 1945.
Right. Denazification in West Germany, for instance. Historical consensus seems to be it was, well, inadequate.
Many former Nazis slipped back into positions of influence.
And then there's the physical danger. Unexploded bombs. Still finding them today, causing evacuations. Thousands thought to remain.
Decades later, and the environmental damage, chemical weapons dumped at sea.
Yeah, after the war, Allied directives led to dumping huge amounts, so maybe 1 million metric tons of captured chemical weapons. UK, US, Soviet Union involved.
And we don't know exactly where it all is.
Not precisely. And there's a real risk of leaks. There have been reports of fishermen encountering sulfur mustard, bombs washing up, even as far as Delaware in the U.S.
Wow. That really drives home how the war's legacy isn't just history. It's still physically present, potentially dangerous.
A potent reminder that the end of fighting doesn't just erase everything.
Okay, so to sort of pull all together from this deep dive, the end of World War II wasn't a simple return to normal. It was this incredibly complex reshaping.
Yeah, economically devastating for many, requiring massive rebuilding, but with very different outcomes.
Politically, new borders, dissolving empires, and the Cold War firmly taking root, ideologies clashing, military buildups.
Even using former enemies in that new struggle.
And air warfare transformed, leading straight to the atomic age, plus these lingering dangers, the bombs, the chemical weapons.
It shows how those immediate post-war priorities, rebuilding, setting up a new order, containing the perceived enemy sometimes clashed with, or maybe just ignored, the longer-term consequences.
Which leads to that final thought for you, the listener. Given that immense destruction, the urgent need to rebuild and prevent another war, how did that urgency sometimes overshadow the long-term ethical and practical fallout of decisions made right then? Like recruiting war criminals or dumping those chemical weapons?
What can that teach us, maybe, about how we handle the aftermath of big global crises today?
Something to definitely think about.